This video just kind of highlights the different types of courts that exist in the country. And 99% of our focus is going to be on the Supreme Court, but you just need to know that there are different types of courts. First, um, in terms of like the difference between like how some courts are created, so those that are basically in the red on this little graphic, all of these are examples of courts in the US federal court system. These are like the national courts. All of those that are in the red boxes, including the Supreme Court, are what we call constitutional courts. Because they're mentioned in the Constitution within Article 3, the judges that are on these courts, right, basically get life terms. Like they're there for their entire lives, or until they choose they don't want to do the job anymore. They're called constitutional courts because they're actually mentioned in the Constitution. All of and that one too, like the district courts. So those that are in the yellow boxes are actually courts that were created by like acts of Congress. Like Congress passed a law saying like we need a tax court or we need a international court of trade. We need military courts. Like all of those were created by acts of Congress. And because they were created by acts of Congress, they're kind of called inferior courts just because the Constitution didn't mention them. And these judges usually don't have life terms because they're part of the inferior courts. And they usually have their jobs for about 10 years. So there's a difference in constitutional versus inferior or like legislative courts in like the amount of time that the judges basically occupy those positions. It's also important to note, right, that there are both state courts and there are federal courts. Like this is an example of federalism too. Just like, there is an executive on the state level, the governor, and there's an executive on the national level, the president, and there is like a legislature on the state level that meets out in Harrisburg, and there's a legislature for the national government which meets like in Washington D.C. There's also state courts, and there are like federal, like national courts. Um, doesn't matter if you're on the state side or the national side, your case can still end up in the Supreme Court. But like there are two different levels of courts, and this is an example of like federalism again. So, like, what determines if your case is in a state court or a federal court? Jurisdiction is a fancy word for who gets to hear your case, right? Does a state court claim jurisdiction, or does a federal court claim jurisdiction? So let's do the federal stuff first. Any cases involving like a federal crime, like your case is automatically going to be heard in a federal court, not a state court. So like bank robberies, counterfeiting, like those types of things are federal crimes, so they're heard in federal courts. Anything involving multiple states. So if there's a crime that involves multiple states, like one person is running sort of like a drug ring that spans multiple states, because you're involving more than one state in that crime, it's going to be heard in the federal court. Any kind of case involving a dispute over the Constitution is going to be heard on the federal side, right? Disagreements between citizens from different states can be heard in federal courts. And again, this was like one of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation system is that there was no national federal court system. So if I was from Pennsylvania and I was suing somebody from New Jersey, there was no independent group to hear that case. Well, there is obviously in our system today. If a foreign country is somehow involved, it's a federal decision, right, or a federal court matter. So, like for example, a corporation that's owned or operates out of a foreign company, it's like a foreign-owned corporation. If a U.S. citizen is involved in a dispute, that would be heard on the federal side. If the government is being sued, like you can sue the United States government, that case would be heard in the federal court system. States can sue the federal government, individual citizens can too. So those are like federal cases. Like what would be heard on the state side? Any kind of cases involving state law. So every state has different laws. If there's some sort of dispute over one of those state laws, it's going to be heard in the state court. Family issues, right? Family court, like divorce proceedings, child custody, like that kind of stuff is going to be heard in state courts. Like local laws, right? Like an Abington Township ordinance or something like that would all be heard on the state side. Traffic court, and then disagreements like between citizens from like the same state, right? So again, these are sort of like the major sort of like issues on like where you would be. And again, like cases about state law. So just to keep it relevant, like a murder case, right? That's a state law, right? That would be heard on the state side. Obviously, if there is some sort of like crime spree where you're involving multiple states, that's a federal decision. And then concurrence means it could be heard in either a state or federal court. If two citizens are involved in a lawsuit that's valued at more than $75,000, you essentially could have the case heard in a state or federal court. So these are the different types of cases that are heard in the respective courts. And probably a lot more cases are heard in the state courts every day than in federal courts throughout the country.